Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome here to the Center for New American Security. Whoops, now I'm back. Now I'm live. Okay, I'm going to start over. Good afternoon. Welcome to this event here at the Center for New American Security. It's called Biopower, Securing American Leadership in Biotechnology. I'm Alison Snyder. I'm a managing editor at Axios. And thank you to everybody who's here in the audience. And thank you to everybody who's watching online. To all of you, we're going to take questions at the end of the discussion. So if you're here in the room, just raise your hand, let us know. And if you're watching online, you can either do that in the chat box on the event page or using the hashtag CNAS 2025 on X. So a lot of the discussion, about U.S. national security and economic security in terms of technology, emerging technology, focuses on AI, with good reason. As companies and countries pursue ever more powerful AI, there are a lot of potential benefits, but there are also obviously a lot of potential risks. But the ability to engineer biology or create entirely new biological systems is also rapidly advancing. It's a lucrative arena for biotech and life sciences companies to sell products and services. There's a need, quash outbreaks. There's endless needs. Quickly create medicines, all sorts of things. But like AI, those come with immense potential and with immense risk. So we're going to talk today about the state of biotech in the U.S. and around the world, and the need and the opportunities and the challenges in building out U.S. biotech and an economy built on these bioengineered products and medicines. To do that, we have right next to me is Vivek Chilukuri. He is a senior fellow and director of the Technology and National Security Program here. I'd feel weird welcoming you to your own place, but hi. Be odd. Jason Kelly. Oh my gosh, this is great. You guys, there was no pre-assigned seating, but you've just done it. I don't know how you did it. Jason Kelly is the CEO of Ginkgo Bioworks, a synthetic biology company based in Boston that's developed a platform to engineer microbes and other biological systems to produce molecules for pharma, ag, food, and other industries. Hi. Doug Friedman is the CEO of BioMADE, a manufacturing innovation institute seeded by the U.S. Department of Defense. And the nonprofit's goal is to create a sustainable domestic end-to-end bioindustrial manufacturing ecosystem. And finally, on the end is Jessica Dymond. She's the vice president of technology at In-Q-Tel. That's the intelligence community's investment arm that funds early-stage tech companies that could sort of benefit U.S. national security. Thank you all for doing this. And I want to start with a big picture question, because I think a lot of this focuses on pharma and agriculture typically. So can we just start by sort of defining what you mean by biotech and bioeconomy more generally? And anybody can take that. If you want to start, just give us the macroeconomic view. Maybe you want to do that.
Sure, I can jump in. And thanks for hosting us at, I guess, the organization I work at. I appreciate the awkwardness of that. Well, look, I think in some ways this is both the challenge and the opportunity of this conversation, because historically when we talk about biotechnology, people think about the vaccines, they think about gene-edited plants and animals, but it's much broader than that. At the end of the day, it just comes down to the technologies that are being used to create products, whether it's gene editing or sequencing or biological manufacturing. And when you think about it that way, it broadens the aperture significantly, right, to defense applications. So we can potentially develop, Jason's nodding because he does a lot of this work, but developing, armor for our soldiers, or replacing inputs for explosives that the DoD can use so that they don't have to import it from other countries. So it's agriculture, it's pharma, it's energy, it's food, it's all of these things, which in some ways can be hard for policymakers and the public to wrap their head around because it's so broad. But I think in some ways it's important to unite that conversation and get people to appreciate the opportunity of the bio-revolution for not just our economy and our health, but our national security.
Does anybody want to add to that when you think about the scope of what we're talking about?
Yeah. Although I just wanted, before I said it, I want to say I'm made uncomfortable by how good of a radio voice Vivek has. So we're just going to do our best to sort of keep up here. Yeah.
What I was telling Jason is I can get away with saying a bunch of nonsense because I can, anyways. But go ahead. Yeah.
I really appreciate that setup, because we've now appropriately set expectations against Vivek for Rock and Time. But I want to build on what Vivek was talking about, and maybe put it in a little bit different terms, and maybe a little bit of a contrast, or not, with AI, which came up, right? If I were to ask, so what is AI for, right? Well, the answer is everything, right? It's going to affect everything. That is the same answer in biotech. It is the same answer in biomanufacturing. And when you start to think about the sectors of the economy and what is the bioeconomy, you know, we, people sitting here, have spent a long time talking about the bioeconomy, but really it's about how is biology and the ability to use it as technology going to impact the economy, not the bioeconomy, but the entire economy. And so we brought up pharma, we brought up ag, we brought up energy. We could talk about commodity chemicals, specialty chemicals, materials. I would challenge, and I do frequently challenge policymakers to say, you know, what are you interested in? What are your economic priorities? Forget about the bio part. What are your economic priorities? And then the response is, okay, well, this is how biotech and biomanufacturing over the next decade is going to have a material impact on those priorities. And that's, I think, the challenge we now face, where we, and Ginkgo is a wonderful example of this, have developed remarkable abilities to engineer biology, but now how do we do it at a scale that actually has broad economic impact? And that is really what the next, you know, maybe the last 2 to 3, and certainly the next 5 to 10 is going to be all about. And when we think about it in the context of national security, being here at CNAS, it is truly framed in the context of global competition. Like, this is happening globally, and the US is extremely well positioned to compete globally, but we also have to take the bull by the horns and take decisive actions, which have started, but really need to pick up if we want to compete on a global scale.
So I think it's important also to acknowledge the broadening of the definition of national security very much alongside those comments, right? Traditionally, we or conventionally perhaps really talk about this in terms of defense applications or intelligence applications. Our definition of national security has expanded dramatically over the last couple of years, right? We all recognize now health security and food security to be very important components of that. Economic security, strategic competition are maybe a little bit more abstract in some ways, but I think critical pillars of broader national security as well. And so it does make this a very challenging conversation to have when you look at the opportunity for biotech to impact all of these different sectors and all of these different pillars of national security. But it really mandates the kinds of discussions we're having here and elsewhere.
Okay.
Jason, go ahead.
Oh, you go ahead. You want to?
Oh,
I can't stop the voice.
Just two quick observations to pick up on Jessica's point, which is one. I mean, I think in some ways biotechnology has gained new urgency as conversations around economic security have gained new urgency. When we think about, you know, trade volatility in our trade policies, insecurity in our global supply chains, which were brought into focus by the pandemic, but frankly haven't gone away, and especially haven't gone away in the last couple of weeks when we think about, you know, who we can depend on for imports and exports. And I think, you know, the promise of biomanufacturing and the bioeconomy, and of course this will not be realized in the short term, but in the medium term, is that, you know, countries, whether you're the United States, whether you're China, whether you're anyone else, can then produce these things themselves domestically. And the second point is, you know, oftentimes with the conversation with AI, there's big debate over job dislocation and job losses as a result of advanced AI capabilities, and that's a separate panel. But no one really talks about that with biotech, right? When people talk about biotech, they're not talking about losing jobs, they're talking about the jobs that can be created all across the country for distributed biomanufacturing. So that's just as a political matter, somebody who used to work on the Hill, I think is a point that people need to digest a little bit more.
So yeah, so maybe I think I'm here to sort of speak a little bit to what's happening in the private sector. So I'll try to do that. I think this point is correct. It's biotechnology is a very general technology, but can be applied to many things. I think though in practice, if you look at the private sector, it's overwhelmingly dominated by the application in pharmaceuticals, right? So yeah, you might have heard of these GLP-1 drugs. Those created close to $1 trillion of market cap in the biotechnology industry over the last couple of years. There's enormous success. That part of the industry is working. The sort of applications in materials, the applications even in agriculture, really aren't, right? So I had the opportunity, we're going to hear from Senator Young later, but to travel to Indiana, go to Purdue University with Senator Young and hear from startups that were trying to get going there around agricultural biotechnology. And overwhelmingly it was, there's no venture capital for this, we can't get this going. And I spent some time like trying to dig in on this because I do think, particularly for the national security applications, many of them are really outside of pharmaceuticals. And we have this general purpose tech, but we're just not seeing it really grow in the materials sector, and even in agriculture, it's pretty stalled. And I think the root reason, so you mentioned this point about its general purpose. So I did a little homework before this panel. So the way we regulate biotechnology goes back to 1986, Coordinated Framework on the Regulation of Biotech, done under Reagan, updated in the Bush administration, 92. And I'm just going to quote from this. There is no single unified statute governing all introductions of biotechnology products into the environment, just as there's no single unified statute governing any of the other basic multi-purpose technologies such as chemical engineering, civil engineering, or the use of fire or electricity. Okay, and it goes on to say, we need to make sure we regulate based on the products of biotechnology, not the process that you use genetic engineering, just as you wouldn't regulate the fact that you use chemical engineering. You would say that chemical is dangerous, that one's not. And if you look across the spectrum of different applications of biotech, there's exactly one market where biotech products are treated fairly compared to traditional products. Do you know what it is? Medicine.
Medicine, yeah.
Medicine. Okay, so the FDA looks and it says, I don't really care if this is a new gene therapy or protein or antibody. You go through the same regulatory process that a small molecule chemical like an aspirin or other drugs go through. We go and run the same experiments to see if it's safe and so on and approve it. That's not the case for those agricultural startups at Purdue. When they go to the USDA and they go to the EPA, the very first question they get asked is, did you use genetic engineering? And it's in total violation, actually, of the sort of statements from the White House. And this was also updated under Obama in 2015. So I think there is an opportunity here if we want to be competitive, particularly in these areas like agriculture and materials, that we need to make the regulations match what we claim we're actually trying to do.
Well, by the way, it's probably no surprise that in the sector you mentioned, we are a clear global leader, right?
Yep. We dominate medicine, right? And I think it is because we allow, it's sort of fairness for biotechnology and medicine, but nowhere else.
So I can offer, yeah, I'm
No,
sorry if
that's
you
okay.
prepared
No,
questions
you guys
we
are-
just
you're
aren't going to
good.
need them. And the way that shapes the private sector is profound, right? So we talk to roughly 1,000 companies a year, 1,000 startups a year that are working in a variety of different areas and some critical technical pillars, including bio. And one of the things we see, so companies that are working in the biopharma space do tend to have access to capital as early startups in ways that other companies do not, particularly those companies that are pursuing technologies like new biomaterials or processes or even platform technologies that ultimately would be offered as services to broader sectors. And so this influences companies in ways to push toward early revenue, that in these very cash-strapped environments that startups are often, super scrappy and every dime counts, using your AI to train models to produce additives for health and beauty products, for example, is much more expedient than perhaps pursuing other kinds of materials that would go into infrastructure development or go into manufacturing processes that are going to have a much longer time horizon to actually hit the market, much less a steeper hill to climb for broader adoption. So there's a big gap there in terms of supporting our early startup community to pursue high impact, high innovation technologies that could have long-term transformative impact in favor of those quick turn, make a dollar, keep the company lights on. A lot of thought is needed in terms of how to cultivate that early, very fragile stage of development.
So what are some of the other pressures that startups are under, and how do they specifically bump up against national security goals? Maybe.
Do you want to start?
Doug?
Yeah, so I'm actually going to build. That's a perfect
Okay.
segue for me to build on something Jess said, and then get into the national security sector a little bit. I think one of the challenges is that in just the conversation we had, we talked about a lot of navigation that is required, right, to just figure out what's there. That means that these startups are spending time having to figure this out, or worse, not knowing any of it's there, doing a bunch, then finding out really the hard way later. And then the question I ask, and BioMADE works with a lot of startups, what do we want startup founders spending their time on? Do we want them spending their time figuring out a morass, to know where to navigate, to figure out where economic opportunity is, where they might see some success, where they might see some early revenue, right? Or do we want them focused on other things, right? And that is a real challenge that we face, and if we're going to be a global leader, we're going to have to grapple with that, because we are really inhibiting our startups from being successful. Now, an area where I think that has started to work is in some national security domains. And I'm going to use the old definition of national security for a minute and talk about defense applications. There are countless defense applications of biomanufacturing that the DoD is really focused on, and frankly is part of why BioMADE exists. The reason we were started in 2020 by the Department of Defense was to ensure that the DoD had the ability to go into the opportunity space that biotech and biomanufacturing offers to do really one of two big bucket things. Neither one of these are fair buckets, I'm going to warn you, but I have to put it in two buckets for this. One is, how do we shore up supply chains for existing materials, right? If we're buying precursors from a place we don't want to, right? How do we get that domestically to solve a supply chain national security problem? And then how are we developing products that really are advantaged from biology, right? Biology can do some pretty cool stuff, and if the DoD is able to put that into systems of record, then that gives us a military edge. And there are a number of examples that are working there, and BioMADE is driving roughly $100 million of those right now. But for obvious reasons, they're not the ones that are out there in the public, right? They're not the ones we necessarily talk about, but that opportunity space is there. And so to this question of where is that sort of starting to work, is the DoD has recognized it. They've made some key investments. They're starting to move things into testing to get the TRLs up, importantly to get the MRLs up, the manufacturing readiness levels. Like if this is successful, are we even going to be able to make enough to matter? That's an enormous problem. How do we pull in more talent from places in the country that we historically have been less good, like the Midwest, right? There's an undertapped resource. Half of my staff is in the Midwest for this very reason. That's starting to work. But how do we really make it work? Well, you have to bake it in to DoD procurement. They have to buy it at the end of the day. We spend a lot of time talking about R&D, but if we don't have the procurement pull to get into systems of record, and I'm glad I'm not the first person on this panel to say the word system of record, it came up before, that is really the next step that's needed. And if there is that pull, and a committed pull, the DoD can be a good buyer. And this is not actually new or novel for biomanufacturing. It's just the time for biomanufacturing. And so if there is that pull, some of the underlying problems that we see in terms of investment, and I'm going to pivot away from venture and talk about things like growth equity. What does growth equity want to see? Well, if you have a customer that's going to be buying your product for an awfully long time at a set price, at a set volume, whatever, growth equity is ready to get into this. That doesn't exist yet. And the DoD can make that happen. And it can have profound positive impacts for national security.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So I agree wholeheartedly, and I think BioMADE is a beautiful example of how we can be cultivating a lot of those early capabilities and really expanding them to become much more sustainable technologies that we can take advantage of over the long term. I think that in thinking about how to bring them to the open market, there's some additional challenges that BioMADE for defense really conquers beautifully, but I think reaching cost parity with conventional products is a major challenge. And here we can pivot to talk a little bit about national infrastructure and how that needs to be developed to include the workforce. But but also just broader biomanufacturing capacity in general, as well as a lot of the R&D that needs to go into advancing the science of manufacturing and the science of scale-up, which is a major hurdle for a lot of these companies as well. So I think there are a couple of adjacencies that if we pick those up alongside something like the BioMADE model could be very, very powerful.
I actually want to ask Jason just how difficult this is just to go to your point. You were founded in 2008, yep. Right? So what is that, 17 years ago?
That's right.
You've gone through a lot of changes, right? There have been, all sorts of changes. You have layoffs, you have restructuring. Yeah. Like, how hard is it, and what are sort of the lessons learned? I mean, you were sort of in the first wave of synthetic bio companies, and
still
a lot of them
here.
still aren't there.
Yeah. Still have my job. There's a couple of things there. So Ginkgo's sort of a special case. We've been driving up with like a technology platform business model, so more similar, think like an Amazon Web Services or like a TSMC in the semiconductor industry, like trying to provide a horizontal layer for the whole industry. And that's what ends up making us interesting. So we've done something like 250 plus R&D partnerships from ag to industrial biotech to biopharma and so on. The fastest growing area for us now is biopharma. So that's sort of like one of the takeaways over the years. What we've been able to get business in has changed. So if you rewind the clock, we really kind of started getting venture capital in 2014, so about 10 years ago. Really all the rage at that point was the opportunity in industrial biotechnology. So being able to make new materials and leathers, and you had all this opportunities in animal-free meat and things like that. That stuff was sort of going with a wave. I think one of the things that I realized, so when interest rates popped in 22, all of those sort of more speculative applications of biotechnology, basically things that aren't therapeutics, once again, evaporated, right? So again, this is how we do emerging technology in the United States, right? Like we use the private sector. So I think there is a thing to watch, which is as the cost of money, time cost of money goes up, we draw out of things that are further away from being able to make money, right? So I think things like SpaceX, for example, and Tesla, those they were a product of a 0% interest rate era in the United States. And I think we got to watch that in other areas we consider to be technologically strategic to the country, right? Because if you look at how, for example, China operates, they'll just plow into areas. Obviously, we lost solar largely for this reason. We got to watch it if it's really an area we think is important. And so, again, I would highlight, I think that is the other sort of side of this coin, is when the private markets aren't there for the parts of biotech that are relevant in defense, how do you backstop it? And then secondly, how do you improve regulatory so the private markets get there, right? Which was my first point. And I actually think that's actually a bigger point. Because a lot of this stuff has really hit the buzzsaw of they timelines to launch these products are almost as long as a drug, but the value is so much less, and that just kills it, right? And that's really what's happened in agriculture, which I think is a huge cost in the Midwest. Yeah.
And if I could just jump in on that point quickly, I mean, going on the regulation side, I would be remiss if we didn't shamelessly self-promote a report that we put out.
I read it.
Oh, it's okay. With my former colleague Hannah Kelly.
My flight was conveniently delayed, so I read the whole report this morning. So go ahead, Vivek. Let's talk about it.
Okay, well, you stayed up. That was just better than most people reading it. But anyways, but we talk about the regulatory side a little bit, and I'm sure most people in America aren't waking up thinking about the coordinated framework that has existed since 1986. But the short version of it is because all four of us are here. All four of us are here. But because biotech is so broad and cross-cutting and touches so many different sectors, the way that Washington has understood it since 1986 is to share regulation across EPA and HHS and FDA. And when we looked at it, I mean, there are 13 offices across the federal government that have jurisdiction over biotechnology. And I mean, there's some virtue to it, but I think from the perspective of a small business, that is a disaster because, you don't have a ton of lawyers, unlike larger companies who can navigate the different, contract requirements and reporting requirements and grants. And so I think there's a ton of opportunity.
So I'm going to take the opportunity for some controversy and push back on this. I heard it from both of you. I'm not so sure the issue is really like the confusion or anything. It's when you work your way through that maze there's like no pot of gold at the end. You
Yeah.
come to find out that the regulation for you is terrible,
Yeah.
right? Once you get to whatever agency it is, but the reality is, again, electrical engineering doesn't have the Department of Regulating Electrical Engineering.
Yeah.
Okay, right? We have different regulatory bodies for automobiles and computers and whatever the heck else, right? You know, and we don't need a Department of Regulating Genetic Engineering. We need genetic engineering to be treated fairly, like it is by the FDA, by the other regulatory agencies. And, that's it. You flip that switch and we go nuts in this country, right? Like we win biotech. But right now we are tying our arms behind our back on this one.
Well, I think it's a matter of streamlining and then making the actual, when you get to the pot of gold, making it more agnostic in terms of means and more focused on products.
It's already the law. It's what it says, you know, right? And I think, you know, we have a new administration here and they should come in and just make it match what's already written from the White House.
Yeah.
But the assumption there is that there is a pot of gold, right?
Yeah.
That there is something worthwhile at the end of this morass, as I think you put it. And I think the cost of navigating this process and the time, which is another cost, right, is often, to your point, Jason, not leading to major financial return, which is what a lot of companies need in order to stay afloat, right? That is just a simple business calculation. And so it's easier to avoid and either go after quick turn products or to really laser focus on high return products that will successfully get through that process. And there's a lot left on the sidelines that is, you know, quite frankly, dying on the vine because we can't accelerate it through this process. There is no financial incentive to be able to do that. And so thinking about how to shore up that process, not even just making it faster, but making room in the market for those things to get through and then produce a return is really, really important. We need to be thoughtful about the landing pad that exists for these new technologies in the world.
Did you want to add to that really quick? And then I have one more question, and then I'm going to go to the audience. Just so you know the plan.
Yes, I do. In this context, I like this pot of gold at the end. Not just the pot of gold. I like the fact that we're talking about it. And that is pot of gold over what time frame and what does it cost to get there? Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is, and Jason has done a great job in this session talking about how clear it is to get there in pharma. Very clear to get there. You also can get a pretty good understanding of what that pot of gold looks like before you're there, right? It's not perfect, but
you're
it's
also
better.
Competing fairly with the other technologies.
And there's clear
In other words, like the chemical guys
well,
don't have an advantage versus you by intrinsic in the regulatory regime, right? Like you're not starting.
I'm not talking about anything
behind
specific.
the start line.
All baked in. You know that's there. A lot of the other sectors that we're talking about are not sectors where you have a giant pot of gold over a relatively short period of time, right? When you're talking about chemical manufacturing, you're talking about a low margin industry. It's a low margin industry. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't have good long-term returns. You can, and all of these things we've talked about need to be fixed, including the regulatory piece. But right now, to get to cost parity, to get to that point, you know, one, the cost of failure is so high that by the time you're partway there, if you realize you have problems with your technology, problems with your economic model, problems in the regulatory system, you've burned through so much money that no one is putting money behind it. And so then what happens? Then you have companies fail and you have a bunch of stranded IP, right? And that's not good. Because what happens to stranded IP, right? Like my hope is that it gets gobbled up by US companies. Does it always get gobbled up by US companies? Definitely not. Right? So how are we putting in place and having a broad national strategy around actually solving these problems? The infrastructure question came up. One of the things that BioMADE is focused on is pilot and intermediate scale infrastructure, because some of the defense applications I talked about, even BioMADE has to scale them outside the country. Mm-hmm. That's not good, right? So we have a pilot scale-up initiative ongoing to solve that piece of the puzzle. But if we don't do it in an integrated and coordinated way, with big action that covers all of the things we've talked about, then we are not going to be successful. And I want to be really clear, China has been doing this for a long time. in this way,
Yeah.
right?
Maybe make one just quick pitch
Go
on this.
for
I
it.
did one more piece of homework because I think we talk all the time about not having the manufacturing infrastructure.
Pilot.
Tons of steel made in the United States, 87 million tons a year. Okay, third in the world. Tons of automobiles, 21 million tons. Tons of biomass manufactured, 342 million tons. So we actually have an enormous physical manufacturing infrastructure. You know, we'll hear it from Senator Young in Indiana, 15 million acres of manufacturing infrastructure. 15 million acres already built out. And we are unable to use it to manufacture advanced materials because we are unable to get through the regulatory and startup and have that vibrant ecosystem reusing that manufacturing land to make things that aren't just food. And we have it. We already have it. But what we're holding back is the technology development.
I want to go to the audience for a question. If you have a question, raise your hand. We have just a few minutes, so no questions? There's one. Thank you. Go for it.
Sure. A lot of conversation about...
Oh, wait, hold on. There's a mic coming to you. Sorry.
Thank you. A lot of conversations about biotech versus other emerging technologies, many of which have had some sort of killer app that sort of brought this to the forefront. And you all spoke very eloquently about how medicine and therapeutics are much more advanced, how ag has regulatory issues but has moved ahead. More sort of beyond those two sectors, is there a perspective killer app or killer use case that would enable us to move from being a foundational technology to one that is easier for policymakers and others who can affect change to understand the urgency? Thank you.
Anybody want to take that? You take that? Go for it.
So I think one of the things we mentioned earlier is the challenge of talking about this in the abstract, right? There's so many different options. There's so many different paths forward. There's so many different areas for impact that it gets very diffuse and very challenging to actually offer a concrete example. And so being able to offer an example for which there is an existing market, for which we can put dollars and cents on something, for which we can actually quantify national dependence on foreign sources, thinking about things like rare earths, for example, we can really begin to tease apart the issue in terms of what is at risk, what are our current dependencies, and what stands to benefit the nation in terms of building this infrastructure out, advancing these capabilities. So biological mining is a great one to look at in terms of not only supporting very broad sectors, but also economic security more broadly, as well as sustainable technologies that are environmentally sound and compliant with regulatory environments that are challenging for other types of technologies to be fielded. So I would really champion taking those concrete examples to think about how to make real and then extrapolating out from there to those more nebulous use cases.
We have like 2 minutes, so I just want to ask one more question, which is a little more newsy one, I guess. So a lot of, like, recently in Washington, the conversation around biotech policy has largely been around Biosecure Act, right, and the idea that, some U.S. companies would have to sever their ties with some Chinese companies. That legislation obviously hasn't passed, but what would something like that at this moment do for what you are trying to do? What would the impact be?
I hear you. You go first,
I'll
please.
start. So we have talked, around and around about cost and speed of bringing these technologies to market, of introducing the impact that they will actually have, being able to scale them. Right now, pennies matter, right? Having to source materials from, or let me say that differently, finding the cheapest sources for labor, for reagents and materials to make these things go, to be able to produce these products, is a key part of the math that companies are often pursuing. And we have more infrastructure here that we need to support, right? It's really not just the back end, the production end of the things we're trying to make, but also all the things that go into them, all the ingredients we need in order to produce them in the first place. So I think that we don't want to force companies into a very limited market or a limited supply for these things without having an alternative ready to offer.
Piecemeal might be asking for trouble. That's my kind of view of biosecure, right? It's looking at one aspect of the problem, and whether you agree with that as one of the possible solutions or not matters to me less than taking a comprehensive approach, right? If biosecure was, Title 12 of your mega bio bill, then I'm looking at at biosecure in the context of everything else that's happening, right? And Title I might be regulatory, right? And Title II, right? And you need to think about it in the context of what is the long-term strategic impact we want to have. And the concern I have is by doing it piecemeal, you end up potentially misunderstanding what the supply chains actually look like, and are we ready for something like that or not? And again, it's not even a judgment on whether that is good or bad, but done in a vacuum is potentially risky at this point in time in this industry.
Yeah, so maybe I just have one quick thing.
Really quick.
We're sideways on the data topic with China. That's the real issue. All these AI models are going to be commoditized. Whoever has the proprietary data wins. They don't share their data. We actually share our data all the time.
Read the report. We got a lot of stuff.
We should force them to do that. And the thing I'll leave you with is we buy all the therapeutics. So for the killer app in biotechnology, the entire market, 70% of it is the United States of America because of our high drug prices. Thank you very much. And so we have enormous leverage over the biotechnology industry in any country, frankly, including China. And so we should demand the data reuse rights we want. We should demand BGI not be Huawei, right? Like we have all the cards here, and we should take advantage of it and get.
I'm going to make three lightning points. One, 40% of China, 40% of the world's active pharmaceutical ingredients come from China, right? We rely a ton on them for CDMOs. Like, if we're going to have a transition to a domestic, robust biotech sector, more so than now, it can't just be the restrict, it has to be the promote. And I think that's sort of the point you were making, Doug, right? It can't be one piece, it has to be a comprehensive piece. The country still doesn't have a national strategy, which is a remarkable fact. There are dozens of countries around the world, including China, that has a national strategy for biotech. We don't have one. We need one. We have some ideas.
In legislation.
Yeah.
Hear, hear.
And that's it. Sorry. Thank you so much. And so please stay seated. We're going to have Senator Young up next, but remarks first. So thank you.
Biopower is the ability of any nation to harness emerging biotechnologies to dramatically strengthen their economic and national securities. Biopower presents a massive opportunity for the United States to create more resilience for our domestic supply chain so that we're not relying on other countries for the essential things that we need to keep people safe from pandemics, to supply our military, to protect our soldiers. These are early days in the technology, but we should ask ourselves, do we want to be in a position where we're relying on foreign competitors like China for the breakthrough biotech that will enable people to restore sight, vision, hearing, to personalize their medicine, to access breakthrough treatments for cancer and other rare diseases? Some studies suggest that biotechnologies could have a direct economic impact of $4 trillion over the coming decades, and there is no reason that the United States can't capture a large share of that given the leadership position that we're already in. The United States has a lead in biotechnology for the moment, but it would be foolish to assume that lead is permanent, and if we are going to extend the lead and secure it for another generation, it's going to take far more ambitious and collaborative work between government and industry. The Trump administration has a massive opportunity to streamline the policies and regulations across the federal government for biotechnology. Because biotechnology touches so many sectors, the regulatory apparatus in Washington is as complex as you can imagine. That is inhibiting innovation in the United States, and I think this new administration recognizes that and has a massive opportunity to fix it.
I shared a lot of sage words of wisdom before I turned the mic on. Thank you again to Alison and to the fantastic panelists for setting up a great conversation today. My name is Hannah Kelly, and I'm a proud alum of the CNAS tech team, where I had the privilege of collaborating with Vivek on this report. I first encountered the biotech issue set with the CNAS Biotech Task Force, and I'm grateful to continue working on these important topics as a policy advisor with the National Security Commission on Emerging Biotechnology, a bipartisan and bicameral U.S. legislative commission under the leadership of Senator Todd Young. Senator Young is a proud Hoosier from the great state of Indiana and a strong champion of critical and emerging technologies on Capitol Hill. He led the charge on the CHIPS and Science Act and co-developed the roadmap for artificial intelligence policy in the U.S. Senate. In addition to Senator Young's roles on the Intelligence, Finance, Commerce, Science, and Transportation, and Small Business and Entrepreneurship Committees, Senator Young serves as the chair of the NSCEB. As stated in this new report, no country is better positioned to lead the biorevolution than the United States, but it requires that policymakers act now to secure America's place as the global biopower. Sharing more on how the United States can cement this position, please join me in welcoming Senator Todd Young.
Well, thanks to CNAS for hosting today, and congratulations on the recent release of your report on U.S. biopower. I have to say it's unusual, perhaps, to begin a presentation on cutting-edge biotechnologies with a reference to a 249-year-old piece of parchment. But our Declaration of Independence is one of the great innovations in human history. Its author saw very clearly a connection between scientific discovery and human flourishing. I mention this because we're amidst a great bio-industrial revolution, one that will not only redefine our security, our productivity, our well-being, but also determine whether the Enlightenment values of our founding or the authoritarian systems of our rivals will underpin the international order in the decades to come. Now, the good news is that with our innovation ecosystem, dynamic private sector, talented people, and world-class research universities, America is poised. We're poised to lead this age of biology. And the United States is already taking some important steps to make the most of this critical technology, which has been a major focus of mine in Congress. But as Hoosiers know from watching the Indianapolis 500, starting in the pole position does not mean you finish first in the end, especially when adversaries are also striving for biotechnological advantage. They help tilt the economic and national security landscapes to their side at every turn. The People's Republic of China, whose government doesn't share our faith in freedom, is determined to displace America as the world's leading biopower. And this matters, not because of a nebulous desire for American leadership, though Americans are a competitive people, but because of these technologies and their power. They pose the ability to sustain or to destroy. And if in the wrong hands and if permeated by the wrong ideology, Americans may find themselves at the mercy of biotechnology engineered for destruction. The CCP and its state-owned companies regularly violate our IP protections. They aim to use overt business deals to dominate new technologies and vulnerable companies. And we know they have a history of directing their national champions to aggressively pursue new capabilities with minimal oversight or control. China, in short, plays to win. And so should we, not by disregarding international norms, but by remembering what helped make America great in the first place. Our ingenious private sector, our valuable alliances. It's these tools that will give us the upper hand when it comes to developing new technologies and fortifying our supply chains. As chair of the National Security Commission on Emerging Biotechnology, my fellow commissioners and I, over the last couple of years, have investigated U.S. biotechnology leadership, and we've developed a suite of policy recommendations to strengthen our own economic and national security position and to counter potential misuse. This work has broadened my own understanding. I've learned a lot over the last couple of years of what biotechnology can produce for the world and how it can help reshape industries previously never considered. Our forthcoming recommendations address key areas where we can bolster our own biotech sector to create a thriving and secure U.S. biotechnology ecosystem. We'll build on some of the good ideas that CNAS's report puts forward, including putting actual legislation out that would action these ideas. To address our vulnerabilities, it's vital to first recognize that our critical biotechnology supply chains are compromised today. American biotechnology companies rely heavily on cheap, fast products and services from their Chinese counterparts. This reliance is risky. It threatens our security, the security of our biological data, and it challenges our ability to not only innovate but to scale and bring our technologies to market right here in the United States. To level this playing field, we must accelerate biotechnology innovation at home. In part, that means getting out of the way of our doers and dreamers and innovators and investors, streamlining regulations, encouraging private capital, and expanding the American biotech workforce will ensure our vibrant innovation ecosystem leads for decades to come. To achieve these goals, our government must be prepared to embrace the potential in America's biotechnology industry. Our government must take targeted action in ways that only the federal government can to ensure that our dynamic and exceptional private sector can do what it does best. We already have many existing resources to support American companies, workers, and researchers. We just need to put those programs to work for biotech. We must also ensure that the benefits of the biorevolution reach every American, from biotech hotspots like Silicon Valley and Boston to rising stars like Heartland Bioworks in my home state of Indiana. This includes the economic and societal benefits of countless new, good-paying jobs to be had in biomanufacturing and other fields, groundbreaking medications and therapies, stronger building materials, and more resilient crops. And for our national defense, emerging biotech presents new options for our defense industrial base and outfitting our warfighters, creating new resilient supply chains and overmatch on the battlefield. While it's critical to strengthen our domestic biotechnology sector, we cannot fully secure and expand our global leadership without robust collaboration with our many allies and partners. Strong connective tissue between the American biotech industry and those of our allies and partners can be a bulwark against fragile supply chains and the potential for irresponsible development and misuse of these technologies by our adversaries. So in just a few weeks, the NSCEB will publish our major report, including a number of policy recommendations to address these and other challenges and opportunities for the U.S. biotechnology leadership. You can expect to see detailed proposals for how the Congress and executive branch can take straightforward steps to advance U.S. leadership. The choice will be ours. But this report does not conclude our work. I must emphasize it. It is the beginning of a new phase, one focused on doing everything we can to help implement our policy recommendations. We'll continue working with my colleagues in Congress to take the necessary action to secure our shared future. So I urge all of you to read both CNAS's Biopower report and our forthcoming NSCEB report and join us and the folks at CNAS in becoming biotechnology champions. We might even work together to establish a certificate if you get through each of the reports. During his presidency, Thomas Jefferson wrote that nobody wishes more than I do that ingenuity should receive liberal encouragement. Now more than ever, that encouragement should continue. Biotechnology has the potential to reshape the United States economy and the lives of millions of Americans, and we must make the most of it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Senator Young. I don't think I can improve on those remarks, and I won't try to. In fact, as someone who's tried to pay attention to what public officials have said about biotechnology over the years, I'm not sure that I've heard a more compelling speech and argument from a public official for American biotech leadership than we heard this morning. Or this afternoon. I appreciate it. And also, as someone who used to work on the Hill, Senator Young is not just a leader on biotechnology, but as my colleague Hannah mentioned, has long been a leader on maintaining America's edge in a range of critical technologies. And his sort of thoughtful approach is more needed than ever. And I also want to thank our terrific panelists for joining us this morning and making the time, some of them dealing with flight issues from Boston, but they still made it. I want to thank Hannah, my co-author on this report, and for everybody in person and online for joining us. As Senator Young said, this is the beginning, not the end, and our work at CNAS on biotechnology is just getting started. We've been working on this for many years, but we plan to meet the growing interest of in biotechnology, epitomized by this forthcoming National Security Commission report, which I encourage everyone to read. We view our report as sort of a teaser trailer for what's to come. But if the conversation earlier is any indication, there was a ton of interest and areas to discuss, from biodata. We didn't even talk about international partnerships. We didn't talk about all the work we need to do to protect our biotech sector from foreign and malign threats. There's a lot of work to do, and so stay tuned, and we plan to hope to have you back soon. But thanks for coming, everybody.